Greetings to those of you who tune in via YouTube, either video, audio only, or however you may be here with us this morning. I'm really grateful to be able to be also in a room with those of you who are here in person. And I know that it's challenging to find yourselves having to be in relationship with Caron, but often that turns out to be really, really good thing also. And I pray that it may be for you. I have a series of topics that unfold in in an ungoverned way. They don't intentionally line up with seasons of the year or specific holidays, but in a curious way, sometimes the alignment is remarkable. Today's theme, coming out of my rotation, is surrender. And as I mentioned before, in the preparation of today's service, we had a bunch of stuff lined up. It's all gone. And so I've been forced this morning to surrender. And then I, as a result of that, sang a hymn, which is in the back of my churchy history, I Surrender All. And I was just struck, the very last line of the hymn in the third verse involves trust in what the Christian community calls the Holy Spirit. So I had in mind today to start with a joke. I kind of hate when preachers start with jokes. It's a sort of conventional device, but I'm going to do it anyway. And it's because I don't know how else to sort of introduce the very specific content that comes from this joke. And I learned this joke when I was in seminary. It's a joke about seminarians. And in fact, I was also, when I was in seminary, I worked as what they called a student pastor, which is like a working internship. So I preached on Sundays, and then typically Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, or Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, I was on campus at seminary. And then I'd go back to my congregational setting. And this joke is that's the setting for this joke, is that two guys who are student pastors have a regular Tuesday lunch in the seminary cafeteria, and they're learning about all this stuff, about theology and spirituality and faith and preaching and everything like that. And one of them says to the other, you know what? If we really trusted in the Holy Spirit, we wouldn't do what our preaching professors say. We wouldn't study, we wouldn't prepare, we wouldn't script, we wouldn't rehearse. We would just go up in the pulpit on Sunday and open the Bible and pick a random verse, read it, and then be inspired by the Holy Spirit to preach a message that was given by God for the day. And the other guy says, you know, you're right. That would be like inspired preaching, right? And so they make a covenant, a pact, that they're both going to try that this particular week, is that they're going to not study, they're going to not pay attention, they're going to not prepare, they're going to not rehearse, and they're going to wait until they get in the chancel on Sunday and just like throw the dice. And so the week goes by, the weekend goes by, and now it's Tuesday of the following week, and they're both coming in, they get their plates from the cafeteria line, they sit down, and they're like small talking, you know, hey, how's it going, what's going on, and everything. And finally, the one guy says to the other, so did you do it? And the respondent says, no, I couldn't do it. On Saturday evening, I panicked. There was no way I could get up in the pulpit and just like wing it. So I looked up the scriptures for the day, and I came up with a message. In fact, I used part of a message I delivered before, and it was sort of okay, but it was kind of awful. Did you do it? And the guy says, oh my God, I had the most incredible spiritual experience I think I've ever had. And the guy says, really? And he says, yes. He said, I was completely obedient to our covenant. I didn't study, I didn't prepare, I didn't script, I didn't do anything. In fact, I tried to distract myself. And then on Sunday morning, people were like, we're looking forward to your message, Pastor. And I was like, I am too. And I said, I got up in the pulpit at the time when the message to be delivered, and I looked at the Bible, I opened it up, and the first verse I looked at, I was like, oh my God, because it was a genealogy. There was no way I was going to preach from that. And so I picked another story, and I was like, this is some story about Ahaz, and I don't even know what it is, but I read 3 verses. And I closed my mind, and I said to the Holy Spirit, please tell me, tell me. And I said, I heard the voice of God as clearly as I've ever heard it. And it said to me, don't ever do this again. So thank you for laughing. I tried that in the car this morning. I'm like, oh, people are not going to find that even funny at all. But it's funny to me because the first time I heard the joke, I was one of the people who was going through this process. And today, my service delivery of messages is a mix of preparation and extemporaneousness, not spontaneity per se, but I allow myself to be relatively unscripted, and yet I have a ton of things I know I could, and I have a central method. So anyway, get into the story, Jack. Surrender is a really key term for our patients and families, and is very much a family and not just a patient issue. And it kind of, there's a part I hope to get to at the end of the message, but when you first are introduced to addiction recovery, almost everyone who first gets introduced to addiction recovery is introduced to it through the lens of the 12-step programs. So this is material that begins in 1935, gets codified in 1939 for the first time, and here we are almost coming up on 100 years later, and we're still teaching and utilizing this 12-step model, which was not clinical, it was not evidence-based, it was not research-driven, it just emerged on the landscape of human history as the very first solution set to the problem of addiction that had traction. There were people probably who found themselves out of the pit of addiction over the centuries and millennia, but there was no well-framed approach to the problem of addiction until the 12 steps emerged in the 1930s and 40s. And when Bill and Bob, the two principal founders of the AA movement, codify this method that emerges in a grassroots way among the people that they start figuring out how to share sobriety with one another, they talk about surrender explicitly, and also as the community starts to take shape and begins to go from 2 to 5 to 10 to 100 to hundreds of thousands, now millions of people, surrender becomes a foundational pillar. It's thought of as one of the key principles, sometimes the step 1 principle, sometimes the step 3 principle. It's like you can't go to a ton of 12-step meetings and not have them frequently address the topic of surrender. And it's because it's both, there's a rightness about it, but it also is problematic, it's challenging for many people. So much so that there are alternatives that come in that don't emphasize it so much later. But one of the reasons why surrender is challenging, I think, besides that it's just challenging, is definitional. So I think that there are, and this is just true of most languages, but it's especially true of English. We have words that have, you look in the dictionary at 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 definitions, and sometimes 4th and 5th definition very significantly distant from the first and second. And sometimes you wonder why they're ordered in a certain way, although the dictionary publishers tend to think they're putting the most prominent interpretations first. Anyway, surrender, in my mind, the first connotation I usually think of is military surrender, in which the antithesis of it would be like still fighting or victory, right? Like never surrender, or oh, those poor people had to surrender. It's a non-favorable outcome. Another way that surrender sort of plays in a way that is not, I think, the primary application for addiction recovery is, I lost my train of thought here. Anyway, surrender in addiction recovery, get to the point, does not involve defeat. In fact, one of the fun aphorisms of the 12-step recovery movement is we surrender to win. And people are like, what? Another thing that I think is maybe what I was about to say is that surrender is often thought of as an individual moment, like in the giving up of a game of chess. When I surrender, the game is over, right? So it's an ending. It marks a previous point and a further point afterwards, in which in the previous point you're engaged in the combat or struggle, and then after the surrender, the struggle is over, and now you move on to other things. But what I want to say about addiction's surrender is neither of those things are true. That addiction's surrender is a victory, not a defeat, and that addiction's surrender is a persisting dynamic, not an event which you get further and further away from as you have made the jump. So, and jump is a good illustration that helps me sort of figure out how to move forward in my message here today, is that people talk about a leap of faith. And many people who think they have surrendered, they're newcomers to this landscape, and it may be a family member who has surrendered to my loved one as an addict, or it may be the addict themselves who is like wrestled with the concept of, I don't know if I am an addict or not, I don't know if I need to stop, I want to like become a social crack user, I'm pretty sure I can, use fentanyl only on Tuesdays, and I'll be fine. Thousands of people die, but I know what I'm doing. And finally, there's this capitulation to the reality of addiction. And people are like, well, they come to the AA meeting and they hear the term surrender, and they're like, well, I surrendered because I'm here. I've surrendered because I'm in treatment. I've surrendered because I have acquiesced to the notion that cessation of the consumption of chemicals, or cessation of this horrible dance of enabling and insanity that happens in the poor family members is got to stop. And I've thrown up my hands and I've like, ugh. And why don't I get applause for that? Why doesn't everybody say, this is, you have surrendered? Why are people still talking about this? I've given up. I've quit. I've resigned. I'm no longer like arguing the point. I'm an addict, or we've brought the person to treatment, and we've set some boundaries, and but surrender in addiction recovery dogs me to this day. And I am clean and sober more than 35 years. And even just this morning's ridiculous challenges for this chapel service are a kind of a humorous shout out to the reality that the surrender I'm talking about is a persisting surrender. It's a disposition. It's a willingness to approach life with a different construct than the one that I had had before I adopted a surrendered life. So, scrambling my outline, but I'm going to go here. So, last night, my wife and I were rewatching a movie yesterday afternoon in preparation for the second part of the movie, which was about to launch, Dune. I don't know if any of you care about Frank Herbert's 1965 science fiction epic, but it's a really important writing in the history of the genre of science fiction, and also was a thing I read as a child and was captivated by. And it is, to read the text is classic and unbelievable. It becomes like 12 books, and some of them are better than others, but the original text is remarkable. And if you think like George Lucas invented Jedi mind tricks, no, read Dune. If you think that like various other science fiction dynamics that play out in Star Trek and Star Wars are just the creation of the people who came up with those empires, that's incorrect. Frank Herbert needs to be acknowledged almost like H.G. Wells or Tolkien as a progenitor of a class of writing that is remarkable and powerful. And then the renderings in the recent movies, like a third time somebody's tried to attempt to do Dune. Stop doing the Dune commercial. Anyway, it's great. And I can't wait for the second movie. But my wife and I were rewatching the first movie, and there's a scene in which the protagonist, Paul, and his mother, Jessica, are in basically what I'll call a chopper. And they're trying to flee pursuit. And so they fly into a dust storm on a planet that has dust storms that are much more severe than our hurricanes. So they're flying into a dust typhoon, and they should die because they're thought to be dead by their pursuers. And as the chopper starts to fall apart, Paul, who is the hero of the story, is beginning to be led by voices that come not just from within, but from beyond him. And, in fact, from his ancestral history. And Paul is trying to fight this chopper, and it's tense and you're worrisome, and then he's inspired to simply let go. And I'm sure his mother is like, "What, bro? Because we're surely going to die." But in fact, as the story goes, and this is just fiction, Jack, but the story is that the abandonment of the thopter to the winds of the storm raised the thopter up to the top instead of having it spiral to the bottom, which is totally, actually, conceivably a consequence, because these storms, even in our day, tornadoes pick up stuff, and what if what if it's in the struggle he would have crashed, and instead in the release he finds himself capable of riding out the storm at this high altitude until it sort of dissipates, and then it's to crash land, but they survive instead of the sure and certain death that they would face. So this is my point, is that Paul in the Dune story, in that chopper event, illustrates a release of control and an entrance into the dynamics of an environment that is actively influencing his state, and allows the environment to bring an outcome that his own effort would not have been able to realize. And I can't even think of a better illustration to what I've come to believe. This is the surrender I try to live into one day at a time. And I have prayers that I say that try to encourage me to let go of the control of the thopter of my life and allow myself to be navigated in ways and in places that I would otherwise not realize. A second way this came into my life, I had a sponsor, his name is Gene, but Gene and I were both sponsees of a guy named Tom. And I asked Tom to be my sponsor 30-ish years ago because he annoyed the crap out of me. And Tom was this older, loving, gay man in a committed relationship with Mel. And Tom and Mel both were in AA, and they would come to movie meetings. They were in ACOA, which also was a thing I was doing. And Tom just exuded this, almost like, I couldn't believe it. It was like this beatific spirituality. He talked about love and about God. And I was like coming out of my atheism, but I couldn't make the jump to that level of trust and reliance on a power greater than myself. And so I asked him to be his sponsor, Jimmy, my sponsor. Tom always had like a flock of pigeons, they call them. I hate that term, but anyway, I became one of Tom's sponsees, as my sponsor Gene was one of Tom's sponsees. We talk about Tom all the time. Anyway, I was going over to Tom's place, his and Mel's place in southern Delaware, which was called Serenity House. We used to, all of the pigeons, we used to say, "Oh, I'm going over to Serenity House today." And that meant you were going to go see Tom and either sit out by the dock, because they had a dock, and or various settings of that lovely home that they had, and have this opportunity to meet with this guy who was handing on his wisdom about recovery. So I went to see Tom on this particular day, early in my relationship with him as a sponsee, and he and I were chatting, and he told me that he had been, this is a little gross, but he had been in the bathroom, and he was reading a day at a time devotional. You know, these things are 365 days. And he said, "I read it, and I thought, this is for you, Jack." And so he had actually ripped out the page, and he gave it to me, and he was like, "I want you to read this every day." The fact that he ripped it out, I think, like really struck me, because I'm like, wow, I would never do that. But anyway, some sort of weird thing I have about not ripping books apart. And the title of the devotion for that day is Let Go and Let God. This is another one of these surrender expressions in the 12-step team that I found very difficult for me. And I want to quote a little bit from that saying, and then I have like 3 things I want to say before we get way too far into time. So the I Let Go and Let God reading, I've read it for years and years and years. I've read it every day for a long time, and now I still have it. In fact, I've typed it up and printed it out and handed it out to patients every once in a while. And what it says is, letting go is not giving up. Because that was my problem. I couldn't let go because I thought I was quitting. Letting go is cooperating with God. It is allowing the activity of God to work in us and in others to bring about the very best outcome for all concerned. Letting go is not giving up. It's cooperating with God. It is allowing the activity of God to work in us and others to bring about the very best outcome for all concerned. I totally believe that now. It took me decades of fearful letting go to start to believe that my meddling was undershooting what God could do, what the universe could deliver, what the storm could carry out. And there's this thing called smart recovery. I don't know if you've ever heard of it, but it's an alternative today in the landscape of choices that patients and family members can make to get supported recovery. Because there's evidence that says don't do recovery alone, outcomes stink. But that you can make some choices about which community of support you want to sort of attach your journey to. And smart recovery, recovery dharma, and the 12-step flavors of various kinds are the three that Caron most strongly endorses. And smart recovery is funny because it sort of advertises itself. It doesn't quite say this, but it sort of says, you don't have to surrender with us. We're about empowerment, and we're about self-efficacy, and we're going to give you tools, and you can do this recovery thing, and we believe in you. You don't have to label yourself an addict. You don't, and it's actually, I think smart is amazing. I'm a smart facilitator. I got credentialed in it because I wanted to be literate in it to be able to support our clients in making choices that they need. But here's this funny thing about smart recovery that I came to see after getting the training and immersing myself a little bit in this world, is that it tends to be so ironic and funny, is that down the road, there's a surrender in smart. They don't use the term. But if you are going to, what you end up doing is you end up letting the controls of your life and letting the smart tools and community keep you sober, guide you. And down the road in the 12-step world, there's self-efficacy and responsibility and engagement. So this idea that surrender is somehow passive is maybe there are surrenders that are passive. But the surrender that recovery invites you to is one that invites responsibility. It's that if you're a preacher, you have to study, you have to prepare, you have to get ready. You can't just walk in and wing it. That's not the surrender that AA is talking about. And interestingly, here this program that says it puts surrender off the necessary list, in fact, in my mind, invites you to just foreground the responsibility piece and then give over and trust to it. Whereas the 12-steppers in the 1930s were like, trust us and then we'll teach you. But it's really kind of six and one half of the other. Now the two sets of tools are quite different in ways that may appeal to one group more than another. But it's in an abandonment of self. There's a loneliness of only I can manage the choices of my life and only I can sort of figure this out. That addiction's freedom and flourishing begins to manifest. And one of the reasons why this is so hard, both for the smart lane, for the dharma lane, and for the spiritual, for the 12-step lane, I believe, is that trust is a thing that gets lost by people who find themselves in the addiction pit. Either there's trauma back there, or there's wounding that comes along the misery of the addiction life. Like, oh, is addiction a community of trust? No. Yeah, I remember hearing, this is another AA aphorism, somebody said, how can you tell an addict is lying? Their lips are moving. And that's sad and mean, but it's also, there's a truth about this, that what happens is that as you find yourself deeper and deeper in the pit of addiction, you tend to surround yourself with other people who are in that world, either because you're buying from them and sharing your use with them, or it's just your self-esteem is so low that they're the only people you can feel like you can hang out with, and it's not a safe environment. So when you first shipwreck on the shores of treatment, and suddenly we're telling you, make this leap of faith because it's safe and you can trust, you're like, I don't think so. And that's what's going on here. Like, which means you're scared. You're afraid to let go of the controls. I don't know how to fix that. I really don't. I think that's the miracle of recovery sometimes, is that people who are so wounded that they're biologically like in flinch response, and somehow they hear a message from someone in the recovery community, or they feel it in their bones as they walk into a room and they're like, oh, I can relax my hypervigilance and let this place and these people help me. And that would be my prayer today, is if you come in with this like suspicion, distrust, it's all about the money, people are full of crap, you know, the last place I went sucked, that somehow you could breathe that out and let help. Let wise counsel come to you and support you in a relinquishment of all of that sense of personal responsibility. If you're a mom for your kid, if you're a spouse for your loved one, if you're an adult with an aging parent, you know, that you've assumed this sense of responsibility, but it doesn't all fall on you in this. We do together what I cannot do alone. So surrender with me. Jump off the leap and find you can fly, right? That's what happens here. It's a beautiful thing. I need to shut up. I'll have more of a service. Thank you so much. God bless.